70 years old, and Eleanor Wick sat alone on a splintered bench outside the Merrow County Courthouse with everything she owned folded into a single carpet bag. Her 2 daughters, Constance and Della, had sold the family farmhouse out from beneath her that spring, convinced by their husbands that their aging mother would be better served by a small stipend and a room in someone else's house than by the burden of her own. She had refused their charity within a week of accepting it, unable to bear the silence that fell over each dinner table when she entered a room, and so she had taken the little money left to her name, $41, and walked until she found herself in the town of Birchfall Hollow, deep in the pine country of the Alleghenies, where a notice nailed to a post office board advertised an abandoned trapper's cabin and its surrounding acreage for $8, seized years before for unpaid taxes and left to rot beneath the pines ever since. She paid the sum without hesitation, though the clerk warned her the cabin had stood empty so long that the forest had nearly reclaimed it whole. She did not know, as she pushed open its warped door for the first time, that the cabin's previous owner had left behind something sealed within its walls that would not only restore her own dignity but would settle a debt the whole town of Birchfall Hollow had spent 40 years believing could never be paid. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Wick. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten, we hope this story reminds you that being overlooked is never the same as being without worth. Tell us in the comments about a time you found value in something everyone else had already written off. Eleanor had been born Eleanor Pruitt in 1856, in a logging settlement called Ash Hollow, the second of 6 children raised by a father who worked the timber crews felling white pine for the mills downriver, and a mother who ran the settlement's only boarding house with an efficiency that left no minute of the day unaccounted for. Her father, Amos Pruitt, was a quiet man who understood with the way some men understood scripture, able to read the grain of a felled trunk and tell you within an inch how it would split, how it would warp, how long it would hold against weather and time. He had no sons who lived past infancy, and so it was Eleanor and her sisters who followed him into the timber camps on weekends, learning to notch a tree for felling, to judge the soundness of a beam by the sound it made when struck, to recognize the particular smell of rot hiding beneath sound-looking bark. It was not conventional instruction for girls of that era, and the other families of Ash Hollow regarded it with a mixture of amusement and faint disapproval, but Amos held firm to his belief that a skill, once truly learned, could never be repossessed by any bank, any husband, any misfortune, and he wanted his daughters to carry something within them that no one else could claim. Her mother, Sarah Pruitt, taught her a different discipline, one born of running a boarding house that fed and sheltered dozens of transient loggers each season: the art of quiet observation. Sarah could read a man's character in the way he hung his coat, in whether he thanked her for a meal or simply expected it, in the small courtesies he extended or withheld when he believed no one of consequence was watching. She taught Eleanor that the truest measure of a person was not what they showed the world in company, but what they did when they believed themselves alone and unwatched, and that a house, like a person, often held its truest nature in the corners no visitor ever thought to examine. Eleanor absorbed this lesson so completely that by the time she was grown, she had developed an instinct for noticing what others walked past without seeing, a habit that would serve her, decades later, in ways she could not yet have imagined as a girl folding linens in her mother's hallway. Ash Hollow's fortune rose and fell with the timber trade, and by the time Eleanor was 20, the settlement had begun to empty out as the easiest stands of pine were cut through and the logging companies moved their operations further into the mountains. It was in this season of quiet decline that Eleanor met Joseph Wick, a carpenter and occasional cabinet maker who had come through Ash Hollow building furniture for the boarding house and stayed, in the end, for Eleanor herself. Joseph was a gentle, exacting man, the kind who would spend an extra hour ensuring a joint fit true rather than send out work he considered merely adequate, and Eleanor found in him a kindred devotion to craft that she had rarely encountered in other suitors. They married in 1877 and settled eventually in a small farming community called Coulter's Run, some 60 miles from Ash Hollow, where Joseph built furniture and did fine carpentry work for the growing township while Eleanor kept their household and, in time, raised their 2 daughters, Constance and Della, born in 1879 and 1882. The years at Coulter's Run were, in Eleanor's memory, steady and good, marked by modest prosperity and the particular satisfaction of watching a home take shape under 2 people's shared labor. Joseph built the farmhouse himself, board by board, with the same care he brought to a cabinet or a chest, and Eleanor filled it with the quiet order her mother had modeled for her, keeping careful accounts of the household's needs and teaching her daughters, in turn, the value of attentiveness, of noticing what others missed. She hoped, in those years, that Constance and Della would carry forward something of what her own parents had given her, though as the girls grew into women, married local men of some standing, and began households of their own, Eleanor noticed with a quiet, private ache that both daughters seemed to measure worth increasingly by appearance and comfort rather than by the deeper craftsmanship their father had always prized. A difference in values that widened, slowly and without any single, dramatic quarrel across the years that followed. Joseph died in 1912, of a lung ailment that had worsened steadily through a hard winter, and Eleanor found herself at 56, a widow managing a farmhouse and modest acreage that had always depended on Joseph's steady income from his carpentry work. She managed for a time on what savings remained and on the small sum she earned taking in mending and selling preserves at the county market, but the years were not kind to a woman working land largely alone, and by the time she reached her late 60s, the farm had fallen into a state of quiet disrepair that neither of her daughters, occupied with their own growing households, seemed to notice or feel moved to address. It was Constance's husband, a practical and not unkind man named Harmon Beale, who nonetheless viewed his mother-in-law's situation as a problem requiring efficient resolution, who first raised the idea that the farm should be sold and Eleanor brought to live, in rotation, between her daughters' homes. Eleanor did not resist the plan at first, reasoning that her daughter's intentions, however clumsily executed, came from some genuine if imperfect concern for her welfare, and she allowed the farmhouse to be sold in the spring of 1926, the proceeds divided in a manner that left her with a modest sum meant to cover her keep as she moved between Constance's household and Della's. But the arrangement soured quickly, for what Eleanor experienced in each daughter's home was not welcome but a carefully managed tolerance, a sense conveyed through 100 small signals, an extra place setting laid with visible effort, hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room, her opinions on the raising of her grandchildren gently but firmly disregarded, that made plain she was regarded as an obligation rather than a mother. When she overheard Della, in an unguarded moment in the kitchen, describe her to a neighbor as a burden the sisters were managing between them, something in Eleanor settled into a quiet, unshakable resolve. She would not spend what remained of her life as an obligation politely endured. Within the week, she withdrew what money remained to her, some $41, and left both her daughters' houses without extended explanation, telling them only that she intended to see to her own situation and did not wish to be searched for or troubled over. She traveled by wagon and then by foot into the pine country of the Alleghenies, drawn by no particular plan beyond a vague memory of the timber settlements of her girlhood and a desire to be somewhere the forest, at least, would not judge her diminished. It was in the small township of Birchfall Hollow, a logging community that had, like Ash Hollow before it, seen its fortunes decline as the surrounding stands of old pine were cut through decades before, that she found lodging for a single night at a boarding house and noticed, pinned to the post office board the following morning, a weathered notice advertising a trapper's cabin and its acreage, seized by the county for unpaid taxes some 15 years prior and never resold, available for the sum of $8 to whoever would take it off the county's hands. The clerk who processed her purchase, a heavy-set, kindly man named Otis Pruitt who had worked the Birchfall Hollow land office for over 2 decades, made little effort to hide his skepticism as he handed her the deed, remarking that the old Hargrove cabin, as it was still known locally though its owner had died some 40 years before, was scarcely more than a pile of logs the forest hadn't yet finished swallowing, and that most folks in the township considered the land more trouble than it was worth given how deep in the pines it sat and how poor the soil had proven for farming. Eleanor said only that she had grown up around timber country and believed she could make something livable of even a poor cabin, a statement Otis took for the determined delusion of an elderly woman with limited options, though he processed the transfer without further comment and gave her rough directions to a property he privately doubted she would manage to even locate on her own. It took Eleanor the better part of a day's walking to find the cabin, following an overgrown logging trail deep into a stand of old pine that grew thicker and darker the further she went, until she came upon a low structure of hand-hewn logs so thoroughly wrapped in creeping vines and fallen needles that she nearly walked past it entirely, mistaking it at first glance for merely another irregularity in the forest floor. The cabin's door, warped nearly shut by decades of moisture and neglect, gave way only after considerable effort, and the interior that greeted her was dim and close, thick with the smell of old wood and mouse nest and the particular mustiness of a space that had not felt fresh air in a very long time. Yet as her eyes adjusted to the gloom filtering through gaps in the roof shingles, Eleanor felt something stir in her that surprised her with its intensity, not despair at the ruin before her but a kind of recognition, the same instinct her father had trained into her decades before in the timber camps of Ash Hollow, an awareness that this small, forgotten structure had been built with real and careful craftsmanship, its joints fitted with a precision that spoke of a builder who had cared deeply about the work, whoever he had been and whatever had become of him. Eleanor spent her first days at the cabin simply clearing it enough to make the single main room habitable, hauling out decades of leaf litter and animal debris, propping the sagging door back onto its hinges, and patching the worst gaps in the roof with bark and pine boughs against the coming weather. It was on the third day, running her hand along the cabin's back wall out of the same habit of careful inspection her father had instilled in her as a girl, that she noticed something which would have escaped the notice of anyone without her particular training. One section of the log wall, roughly waist height and perhaps 3 feet across, was constructed differently from the rest, the logs there slightly thinner, the notching subtly less weathered than the surrounding timber, as though that portion of the wall had been built or rebuilt at a different time than the cabin's original construction, a discrepancy so slight that she suspected even the most careful eye might have passed over it entirely. It took Eleanor nearly 2 full days, working with a hatchet and pry bar she found rusting among the cabin's few remaining tools, to carefully work loose the section of wall she had identified, and when the false panel of logs finally gave way, she found behind it a shallow cavity built into the wall's thickness, lined with what remained of a decayed canvas wrapping, and within that wrapping a small iron strongbox, rusted at its corners but still sealed, along with a bundle of papers that had been protected enough by the box's proximity to remain largely legible despite the passing decades. Her hands trembled as she worked the strongbox's simple latch free, and when it finally opened, she found inside not treasure in the conventional sense but something she would come, in time, to understand was worth far more to the people of Birchfall Hollow. A set of hand-drawn survey maps, carefully annotated in a meticulous hand, along with a bundle of letters and a short handwritten account signed by a man named Elias Hargrove, dated across the final years of the 1880s. Reading through Elias Hargrove's account by the grey light filtering through her patched roof, Eleanor pieced together a story that explained both the cabin's abandonment and, she would soon come to realize, the fortunes of the entire township that had grown up around it. Elias Hargrove had been, according to his own careful record, not merely a trapper as local memory remembered him, but a surveyor who had once been employed by the Birchfall Timber and Land Company to map the mineral and timber rights across the surrounding mountains in the years before the company's original owners sold out to a consortium of investors from Pittsburgh. In his survey work, Elias had discovered and carefully documented a substantial vein of high-grade coal running beneath a section of ridge land just north of the township, land that at the time of his survey belonged collectively to the township itself under an old common grant, unclaimed by any single owner and used by the town's residents for grazing and modest timber harvesting. Elias's letters revealed that when he brought this discovery to the attention of the timber company's owner at the time, a man named Cyrus Thorne, rather than seeing the township properly compensated for a resource that sat beneath commonly held land, Thorne had instead quietly and illegally filed claim to the mineral rights beneath the common land in his own name, exploiting a gap in the township's poorly kept property records, and bribing a county surveyor to falsify the boundary lines in his favor. Elias, troubled by what he had witnessed and unable to prove the fraud through official channels controlled by men loyal to Thorne, had made his own careful copies of the original survey data before Thorne's falsified version replaced it in the county records, and had hidden them, along with a sworn account of what he had witnessed, believing that someday the true boundaries might be proven and the township's rightful claim to the coal beneath its common land might yet be restored. He had intended, his final letter explained, to bring his evidence before a circuit judge he trusted, but he had died of a sudden fever before he could complete the journey to do so, and his hidden evidence had lain forgotten in the cabin wall for nearly 40 years while the Thorne family, and later the mining conglomerate that had purchased the rights from them, had quietly extracted a fortune in coal from beneath land the township had never known it was rightfully owed compensation for. Eleanor sat with this discovery for the better part of a week, understanding as she read and reread Elias Hargrove's careful documentation that what she held in her hands was not merely an old grievance but potentially an active claim of extraordinary significance, for the mining operation on the ridge, now controlled by a company called Ridgeline Coal and Coke, continued to extract coal from that same vein to that very day. Coal that by rights, if Elias's original survey proved accurate and provable, belonged in substantial part to the township of Birchfall Hollow itself under the terms of the old common grant, a fact that could mean the difference between continued decline and genuine restoration for a town that had spent 40 years believing its best days were permanently behind it. She did not act rashly, for she understood, from her mother's old lessons about reading character and circumstance carefully, that a claim of this magnitude would require far more than an old man's letters to prove, particularly against a company with decades of resources and legal standing behind it. She spent the following weeks quietly making the cabin more permanently habitable while making careful, unhurried inquiries in the township, presenting herself simply as the new owner of the old Hargrove place and asking, in the manner of idle curiosity, about the town's history and its old common lands. What she learned confirmed and deepened her understanding of the situation. Birchfall Hollow had indeed once held substantial common land under an old township grant, land that current residents vaguely remembered their grandparents mentioning but which had, through the passage of decades and the quiet maneuvering of the Thorne family and their successors, come to be regarded as simply another piece of Ridgeline Coal's legitimate holdings, its true origins forgotten by all but the oldest residents. Eleanor brought her careful inquiries eventually to a semi-retired attorney named Walter Jenn, a widower in his 60s who had once practiced law in the county seat before returning to Birchfall Hollow to live out his remaining years in quiet fishing and reading, and who possessed, she had learned through her discreet questioning, both a reputation for integrity and a personal history of frustration with Ridgeline Coal, whose expanding operations had, some years before, damaged a stream that ran through property Walter had once owned, a grievance the company had never adequately addressed. Walter received Eleanor's account with initial skepticism that gradually gave way to genuine, absorbed attention as she laid out Elias Hargrove's survey documents and letters before him, his lawyer's eye tracing the careful annotations with mounting recognition of what they might represent. It was Walter who explained to Eleanor the delicate legal reality of her situation, that Elias Hargrove's documents, while compelling, would need to be corroborated by independent surveying evidence and, ideally, by testimony or records confirming the original common grant's boundaries before any claim could be brought against a company as entrenched as Ridgeline Coal. He warned her, with the seasoned caution of a man who had watched more than one worthy cause founder against moneyed interests, that the mining company would almost certainly resist any such claim with every resource available to it, and that pursuing the matter would likely draw the attention and hostility of powerful people who had grown very comfortable with the current arrangement. That hostility arrived sooner than either Eleanor or Walter anticipated, in the person of Randall Thorne, grandson of the original Cyrus Thorne and now a senior manager overseeing Ridgeline Coal's operations in the region, a smooth, carefully composed man who arrived at Eleanor's cabin on a crisp autumn afternoon ostensibly to welcome the township's newest resident but whose true purpose became evident within minutes of conversation, when he inquired, with studied casualness, whether Eleanor had found anything of particular interest in her renovations to the old Hargrove place. Eleanor, drawing on the same steady composure that had carried her through decades of quiet observation, gave nothing away in that first meeting beyond polite acknowledgement that she had found the cabin an interesting piece of local history, but she understood immediately that word of her inquiries had somehow reached Ridgeline Coal, and that Randall Thorne's visit was reconnaissance rather than neighborly courtesy. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor and Walter found themselves navigating an escalating campaign of quiet pressure that Randall Thorne orchestrated with the practiced subtlety of a man accustomed to managing local opposition without ever appearing to do so directly. Merchants in the township who had extended Eleanor small courtesies of credit suddenly found reasons to require payment in full. A county surveyor Walter had quietly approached to conduct an independent verification of the old boundary lines abruptly declined the work, citing a scheduling conflict that Walter suspected, though could not prove, had been arranged through pressure from Ridgeline's considerable influence over local contracts. Randall Thorne himself made one further visit to Eleanor's cabin, this time abandoning any pretense of neighborly interest, suggesting with cold directness that an elderly woman alone in the world might find her remaining years considerably more comfortable with a modest but generous settlement from Ridgeline Coal in exchange for her silence and the surrender of whatever old papers she believed she had found. An offer Eleanor declined with the same unhurried dignity she had carried since arriving in Birchfall Hollow, informing him only that the matter was no longer hers alone to settle, for it belonged to the whole township whose common land had been taken from it. Undeterred, Eleanor and Walter pursued a different avenue of verification, traveling together to the state archive in the county seat where, after considerable searching through decades of poorly organized township records, Walter located an original, uncorrupted copy of the 1850s Common Land Grant establishing Birchfall Hollow's collective ownership of the ridge acreage in question, a document that had survived only because it had been filed, through bureaucratic oversight, under the township's earlier name before it was formally incorporated, escaping the quiet alterations Cyrus Thorne had arranged decades before in the more commonly referenced records. Cross-referenced against Elias Hargrove's careful survey annotations, the original grant provided exactly the independent corroboration Walter had said the claim would require, establishing beyond reasonable dispute that the coal-bearing ridge land had never legitimately belonged to the Thorne family or its corporate successors at all. Armed with this evidence, Walter brought the matter before the Township Council and, subsequently, before a circuit court in the county seat, presenting a case that drew considerable attention throughout the region once word spread that the long-declining town of Birchfall Hollow might be owed decades of compensation for coal extracted from land that had never rightfully belonged to the company profiting from it. Ridgeline Coal, through Randall Thorne and a team of attorneys brought in from Pittsburgh, fought the claim with every resource available to them, arguing decades of unchallenged possession and questioning the authenticity of documents found, as their attorneys pointedly noted, in the walls of a cabin owned by an elderly widow with what they characterized as an unusual and possibly unreliable personal history. But the original land grant, verified independently by the State Archive, and Elias Hargrove's meticulous survey work, corroborated by an independent surveyor Walter finally secured through contacts outside the county, proved impossible for even Ridgeline's considerable legal resources to fully overcome. The Circuit Court's ruling, delivered in the spring of 1927 after months of proceedings that had transformed Eleanor Wick from an unknown newcomer into perhaps the most discussed resident in Birchfall Hollow's recent history, found decisively in the township's favor, establishing that the ridge land and its coal rights had indeed remained under the town's common ownership despite decades of Ridgeline's unauthorized extraction, and ordering a substantial settlement to be paid to the township in compensation for coal removed under the false claim, along with an ongoing royalty arrangement for future extraction that would provide Birchfall Hollow with a steady, meaningful income for the first time in the town's declining history. Randall Thorne's position with Ridgeline Coal did not survive the scandal that followed revelation of his grandfather's original fraud and his own attempts to suppress its discovery, and he departed the region within the year. His family's decades of quiet profit at the township's expense finally and publicly ended. Eleanor did not seek personal enrichment from the settlement beyond a modest sum the grateful Township Council insisted she accept for her role in uncovering what had been hidden from them for 40 years. Some she used to properly restore the Hargrove cabin into a comfortable, permanent home rather than pursuing any grander claim to which her discovery might have entitled her. The bulk of the settlement, at her own suggestion and to the Township Council's considerable relief, was directed toward rebuilding Birchfall Hollow's aging schoolhouse, repairing roads that had gone neglected for a generation, and establishing a small fund to assist elderly residents who, like Eleanor herself had so nearly become, found themselves without family support in their later years, a provision she insisted upon with quiet but immovable determination, understanding better than anyone in that town what it meant to be counted as a burden rather than a blessing. We began this story with a 70-year-old woman sitting alone on a courthouse bench with everything she owned in a single carpet bag, cast aside by daughters who had come to regard her as an obligation to be managed rather than a mother to be cherished. It is worth returning now to that image, because it holds within it the whole of what Eleanor Wick's life had prepared her to understand and what she, in the end, restored not only to herself but to an entire forgotten township. She had been raised by a father who believed a true skill could never be repossessed by circumstance, and by a mother who taught her that the truest measure of anything, a house or a person or a town's own history, was found in the corners others walked past without ever truly looking. Her daughters had believed her age and reduced circumstances made her a diminished thing, a burden to be politely tolerated. But Eleanor had spent 7 decades learning that worth is rarely visible on the surface of things, not in an overgrown cabin wall, not in an elderly woman others had already dismissed, and not in a set of old survey papers sealed away in darkness for 40 patient years. The cabin did not make Eleanor Wick valuable. It simply gave the town of Birchfall Hollow, at long last, the chance to see what had been true of her all along, and to recover what honesty alone had kept waiting until she came to claim it. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight and for walking alongside Eleanor through the whole of her story. If her quiet resolve moved you, we hope you will share this with someone who might need reminding that being counted out by others is never the same as being without worth. Before you go, we would love to know, what is a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had already written off as finished? We read every story you leave for us in the comments, and each one reminds us why we tell these stories in the first place. Until next time, stay close.